On my wedding night, a massive freight truck slammed into the passenger side of our car. The sickening crunch of tearing metal and shattering glass echoed in the dark. My husband died instantly while I was left bleeding and fighting for my life in the twisted wreckage. A week later, the police finally caught the driver. But when he spoke, his confession shattered my entire reality. He was not just a drunk driver who lost control in the rain. He was a hired hitman, and his actual target was me. My name is Sydney, and I am 33 years old. I built a highly successful cyber auditing firm in Chicago, from the ground up, turning raw financial data into undeniable truths. I started my business in a cramped studio apartment and fought my way into a downtown high-rise. I know how to spot a lie hidden in a spreadsheet. But nothing could have prepared me for the terrifying deception hiding within my own marriage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who thought their wealth and power meant they could destroy you and get away with it. The rhythmic and mechanical beeping of a hospital heart monitor was the first thing that pierced the heavy fog in my brain. I forced my eyes open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. Pain radiated through every inch of my body. My chest felt like it had been crushed under a concrete block, and my right arm was immobilized in a heavy medical cast. I tried to speak, but my throat was completely dry, like I had swallowed sand. A nurse noticed I was awake and immediately called for the attending physician. Dr. Miller, a soft-spoken man with tired eyes, walked into the room and stood at the foot of my bed. "Sydney," he said gently, "you have been in a medically induced coma for 2 days following a severe car accident. You suffered 3 broken ribs, a fractured arm, and a severe concussion. You are incredibly lucky to be alive." I tried to form the word Carter, my husband. The memory of the blinding headlights piercing through the heavy rain rushed back into my mind, followed by a terrifying blank space. Dr. Miller lowered his gaze and let out a heavy sigh. "I am so sorry, Sydney. The impact was catastrophic on the driver's side. Carter did not survive the crash. He was pronounced dead at the scene." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Dead. Carter, my charming and handsome husband of less than 24 hours, was gone. A cold numbness began to spread through my chest, but before I could even process the absolute devastation, the heavy wooden door of my hospital room burst open. There was no gentle knock and no polite inquiry from the nurses. Vivian Reynolds, my 62-year-old mother-in-law, stormed into the room with her oldest son Trent following closely behind her. Vivian was a woman who practically ruled Chicago real estate circles with an iron fist and a designer wardrobe. She despised me from the very moment Carter introduced us, making no secret of her disdain for my working-class background. Just hours before the crash at our wedding reception, she had loudly complained to her wealthy friends that her son was settling for a glorified accountant. I fully expected to see a grieving mother destroyed by the sudden and tragic loss of her youngest child. Instead, Vivian stood at the edge of my bed, immaculate in a tailored black suit, with not a single hair out of place and absolutely no tears in her cold, piercing eyes. Trent stood beside her, checking his expensive watch, looking more annoyed by the sterile hospital environment than heartbroken over his dead brother. The doctor tried to intervene, stating I needed critical rest, but Vivian completely ignored him, pushing past the medical equipment. She stepped forward and slammed a thick manila folder directly onto my lap, right over my bruised and aching ribs, causing me to gasp in pain. "Sign it," Vivian commanded, her voice sharp and completely devoid of any human emotion. I stared at the folder, my vision still slightly blurry from the heavy pain medication pumping through my veins. "What is this?" I managed to croak out, my throat burning with every syllable. "It is an expedited cremation authorization," Trent answered for her, shoving a premium silver pen into my uninjured left hand. "We are handling Carter arrangements immediately. The Reynolds family does not wait around, and we certainly do not drag out tragedies for public spectacle. Sign the paper right now so we can get this over with and move on." I looked down at the legal document. It authorized the immediate cremation of Carter remains within 24 hours, explicitly waiving any right to a further autopsy or independent medical examiner review. My cyber auditing instincts, the very analytical skills that made my company so successful, instantly flared to life despite my physical trauma. In my line of work, rushing to destroy evidence was the ultimate red flag. People only burn records when they are terrified of what an audit might find. Why the rush? I asked, my voice gaining a fraction of strength as cold suspicion began to override my blinding grief. The police investigation into the crash is not even finished yet. Vivian leaned in close, her face just inches from mine. Her expensive perfume smelled like a cold, sterile funeral parlor. You brought a curse on my son the moment you trapped him into this ridiculous marriage, she hissed, venom dripping from every single word. You are the reason he is dead. Do not waste another minute of this family time or resources playing the grieving widow. Sign the papers, Sydney, and get out of our lives for good. The heavy oak doors of the prestigious downtown Chicago cathedral loomed ahead like the entrance to a fortress. The media presence swarming the sidewalk was suffocating. Camera flashes blinded me as I struggled up the steep stone steps. Every single movement sent sharp, agonizing fire through my fractured ribs, but I absolutely refused to accept a wheelchair. I leaned heavily on my aluminum crutches, forcing myself to stand tall. Beside me stood my younger sister, Bethany, and her husband, Trevon. Trayvon was a towering African-American man with a sharp, tailored suit and a gaze that could cut straight through steel. He had spent a decade working as a forensic financial investigator for the FBI, tracking down white-collar criminals before opening his own private intelligence firm. Today, he was not just my brother-in-law. He was my shield against the wolves waiting inside. The cathedral sanctuary was packed with the city real estate elite, powerful politicians, and silent investors. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of white lilies and performative grief. I made my way down the long center aisle, my crutches clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The low murmurs of the wealthy crowd completely died down as they turned their heads to watch the battered newlywed widow approach. They stared at my cast, my bandages, and my bruised face with undisguised morbid curiosity. 10 feet away from the front pew, Vivian stepped directly into the center aisle, blocking my path. She wore a custom designer black veil and a diamond mourning brooch that caught the light from the stained glass windows. Trent flanked her right side, standing like an obedient guard dog. Vivian held up a black-gloved hand, palm facing me, stopping me dead in my tracks. "You have gone far enough," Sydney, Vivian announced. Her voice was not a quiet whisper of a grieving mother. It was deliberately projected to ensure the first 5 rows of VIP guests and major shareholders heard every single word. "This place is for Reynolds' blood. A hired hand like you has no right to sit with us. Go find a seat in the back with the rest of the event staff." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby pews. My knuckles turned completely white as I gripped the handles of my crutches. I did not shed a single tear, and I did not lower my gaze. In my world of data and auditing, numbers dictated reality, and the legal reality was that I was Carter's legally wedded wife. Before I could formulate a response, Trevon stepped smoothly in front of me, placing his large frame between my broken body and Vivian hostility. He did not raise his voice, but the deep, authoritative bass of his former federal agent training commanded absolute attention across the silent room. "She is his legal wife, and the only legal heir to his estate," Trayvon stated, staring directly down at Vivian without a flinch. "Step aside right now, or I will personally call the Chicago police and have you arrested for harassing a family member at a public service." Trent stepped forward immediately, puffing out his chest to intimidate us. "Watch your mouth. This is our church, and you do not belong here." Trayvon did not even blink. He adjusted his suit jacket, slightly revealing just enough of his tailored shoulder holster to make Trent freeze in his tracks. "I know the federal and state law." "Trent," Trayvon replied, his tone turning ice cold, "do not test me today. The media outside would love a front-page photo of the Reynolds family dragging a crippled widow out of her own husband's funeral. It would tank your company stock prices before the markets even open tomorrow morning. Vivian's jaw tightened so hard I genuinely thought her teeth might crack under the pressure. She despised public scandals that she could not manipulate and control. Realizing the wealthy investors and politicians were watching her every move, she shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She slowly stepped aside, clearing the path to the front row. "You will regret this," Vivian hissed under her breath as I passed her. "Enjoy your front row seat. It will be the last thing you ever get from us." I took my seat in the front pew, Bethany holding my uninjured hand tightly, while Trayvon sat on my other side, acting as a physical barrier against Trent. I stared straight ahead at the polished mahogany casket resting at the altar. It was closed. Vivian had managed to fast-track the cremation paperwork by going over my head with a team of high-priced lawyers, while I was still heavily sedated in the intensive care unit. The ashes inside that expensive wooden box were supposed to be all that remained of the man who had promised to love me forever. But as I sat there listening to the paid, eloquent eulogies and watching Vivian dab perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, my analytical brain started working overtime. I tuned out the choir and focused on the data points surrounding me. I observed the men in the expensive tailored suits sitting in the rows behind us. They were not whispering about Carter's sudden passing or sharing fond memories of his life. They were urgently whispering about dropping market shares, frozen real estate portfolios, and securing corporate assets. My cyber auditor instincts flared wildly. I analyzed the body language of Trent, who was constantly checking his phone instead of mourning his brother. I looked at Vivian, who was scanning the room to see which investors had shown up. This was not a funeral for a beloved son. This was a carefully orchestrated crisis management event designed to calm panicking shareholders. The Reynolds family was not drowning in grief. They were drowning in a financial panic, and I was sitting right in the middle of their blast radius. The exhaustion hit me the moment I stepped inside the downtown penthouse Carter and I shared. Every breath I took felt like inhaling glass. Bethany guided me to the leather sofa while Trayvon secured the front door, locking the deadbolts. I had just survived the most grueling funeral of my life, but the nightmare was far from over. I barely had time to elevate my casted arm when a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed through the hallway. Trayvon exchanged a sharp look with me before approaching the entrance. He glanced through the peephole, his jaw tightening instantly. Before Trayvon could even unlock the deadbolt, the door was shoved open with brute force. Trent marched into my living room, tracking dirt onto the pristine white rug. Right behind him was a man in a bespoke gray suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately as the senior legal counsel for Reynolds Real Estate Group. "You have exactly 2 hours to pack your bags and vacate this property," Trent announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The security team downstairs has already been notified to disable your building access codes by midnight." Bethany jumped up, her protective instincts flaring. "Are you out of your mind, Trent? She just buried her husband today. She is heavily medicated and recovering from major trauma. You cannot legally throw a widow out of her own marital home." Trent smiled, a cold, predatory smirk that made my stomach churn. He did not look at Bethany. He kept his eyes locked on me, enjoying every second of his perceived power. "Actually, I can do exactly that," Trent replied smoothly, stepping aside to let the lawyer take the floor. "Because this penthouse belongs to the Reynolds Corporate Trust. And according to the legal agreement Sydney signed, she has absolutely no claim to it or to anything else my brother owned." The lawyer clicked his briefcase open on my kitchen island. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents and slid it across the marble surface toward me. "This is a legally binding prenuptial agreement executed and notarized 3 weeks prior to your wedding day." The lawyer stated, his tone completely devoid of empathy. "It clearly stipulates that in the event of Carter passing, all of his personal and corporate assets revert entirely to Vivian control. Furthermore, Section 4 explicitly details that 80% of your business shares in your cyber auditing firm will immediately transfer to Vivian to settle outstanding financial obligations incurred during your relationship." My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing cold. I pushed myself up from the sofa, ignoring the screaming pain in my ribs, and limped over to the kitchen island. I stared down at the crisp white paper. I had never signed a prenuptial agreement. When I brought it up months ago, Carter had played the ultimate romantic, playing the victim of a wealthy family who just wanted a pure marriage uncorrupted by lawyers and contracts. He had convinced me we did not need one. I leaned heavily against the counter and scrutinized the final page. There it was. My signature in blue ink perfectly positioned above a notary stamp. To an untrained eye, it looked flawless. But I was not an untrained eye. I built my entire career spotting financial fraud and document tampering. I spent a decade auditing forged ledgers and falsified corporate contracts. I leaned closer, analyzing the ink distribution. The pressure applied on the loop of the letter S was entirely wrong. There was a microscopic hesitation, a tiny ink bleed on the downward stroke where the forger had paused to mimic my natural handwriting flow. It was a sophisticated high-level forgery, but it was absolutely fake. "This is a forgery," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I never signed this document, and I certainly never agreed to surrender 80% of the company I built from nothing. Carter and I agreed to no prenuptial contracts. You and your mother fabricated this to steal my business." Trent let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "You are delusional, Sydney. The heavy painkillers must be messing with your head. You signed it willingly in front of our family notary. We already submitted it to a judge this afternoon and secured a temporary emergency order enforcing its terms. You are officially trespassing on Reynolds' property." My blood boiled with a pure, unadulterated rage. They were not just trying to erase my existence from Carter life. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover of my cyber auditing firm. My company was highly profitable, debt-free, and held massive government contracts. Vivian and Trent wanted to strip me of my life work and leave me homeless on the streets. I opened my mouth to fight back, but Trayvon placed a firm hand on my uninjured shoulder. He leaned over the island, his dark eyes scanning the notary stamp and the date printed on the fraudulent document. He did not shout. He operated with the cold precision of a former federal agent assessing a crime scene. "Sydney, we are leaving," Trayvon said quietly, cutting off my protest. "If you stay here and fight this tonight, Trent will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. A highly publicized arrest record will instantly damage your security clearance and your credibility as an auditor. That is exactly what they want. They want you to look crazy and unstable. We fight this in federal court, not in a living room screaming match." Before the lawyer could pull the document away, Trayvon swiftly pulled out his phone and snapped 4 high-resolution photos of the signature page and the notary seal. Trent lunged forward to grab the phone, but Trayvon simply leveled a deadly glare at him, daring him to make a physical move. "Pack what you need for the night," Sydney Trayvon instructed, never taking his eyes off Trent. "We are going to my house. Let them have the empty apartment. They are going to need the space to practice their defense strategies when the real authorities get involved." I did not pack any of Carter's things. I grabbed my secure work laptop, my encrypted hard drives, and my passport. I walked out of the penthouse without looking back, leaving Trent and his lawyer standing in the kitchen. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully broken me. They had absolutely no idea that by trying to steal my auditing firm, they had just declared war on the one woman who knew exactly how to dismantle their entire fraudulent empire piece by digital piece. The guest room in Bethany and Trayvon's suburban home was quiet and safe. The heavy blackout curtains blocked the streetlights, but they could not block the memories playing on a relentless loop in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blinding headlights of the freight truck. Every time I took a breath, my fractured ribs screamed in protest. I refused to take the heavy prescription painkillers the hospital had given me. I needed a clear head. I was sitting in the middle of a war zone, and numbing my brain was exactly what Vivian and Trent were counting on. Down the hall in the converted home office, Trayvon was already working. I pushed myself out of the guest bed, gritting my teeth against the sharp stab of agony in my chest, and made my way to his workspace. The room was illuminated by the harsh blue glow of 4 high-definition monitors. Trayvon sat in a leather ergonomic chair, his large hands moving across the mechanical keyboard with the rapid precision of a man who had spent his entire career hunting digital ghosts. He did not look up when I leaned against the doorframe, but he slid a steaming mug of black coffee across the desk toward me. I ran the signature photos through a biometric handwriting analysis software, Trayvon said, his deep voice cutting through the silence of the house. You were right, Sydney. It is a masterful forgery, but the software caught the anomalies. The pen pressure is entirely uniform, which is biologically impossible for a human hand writing a natural signature. They likely used an automated autopen machine, tracing a high-resolution scan of your actual signature from a previous corporate filing. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee, letting the caffeine sharpen my senses. The Reynolds family had infinite resources and a legal team that specialized in burying people alive. They had carefully orchestrated this hostile takeover to steal my cyber auditing firm and leave me destitute. But their arrogance made them sloppy. They assumed a grieving widow would just sign whatever was put in front of her. They did not factor in my expertise or Trayvon federal law enforcement background. We need to trace the origin of that prenuptial agreement, I told him, keeping my voice steady. Vivian could not have notarized a fraudulent document without leaving a digital footprint. We pull the public records of the notary stamp, check the metadata of the digital filings, and find the exact Internet Protocol address where that document was created. Trayvon nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Already on it. I am pulling favors from my old bureau contacts to get backdoor access to the county clerk database. If Vivian paid someone off to stamp that paper, I will find the wire transfer. The clock on the wall read 2 in the morning. The house was utterly silent except for the rhythmic clicking of the keyboard. I should have been mourning the love of my life. Instead, I was treating my husband's death like a hostile corporate audit. I pushed the grief down, locking it away in a dark corner of my mind. There would be time to mourn later. Right now, I had to survive. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the room was shattered by a harsh electronic ringing. It was not my phone. It was Trayvon's encrypted burner phone, the one he strictly used for communicating with active federal agents and confidential informants. The sudden noise made my heart slam against my broken ribs. Trayvon stopped typing instantly. His posture went completely rigid. He grabbed the device, checking the caller identification. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and a silent communication passed between us. This was not a social call. He answered, pressing the speaker button so I could hear. The voice on the other end was gruff and professional, backed by the chaotic ambient noise of a busy police precinct. Trayvon. It is Detective Ramirez, from the Chicago Police Department Major Crimes Unit. I know it is late, but I need you to confirm something for me. Is your sister-in-law Sydney currently at your residence? Trayvon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. She is standing right next to me, Ramirez. What is going on? There was a heavy pause on the line. The sound of papers shuffling echoed through the speaker. We caught the driver of the freight truck, Ramirez announced, his tone completely devoid of any casual warmth. State troopers intercepted him trying to cross the border into Indiana an hour ago. His name is Leo. He abandoned the rig and tried to make a run for it on foot. My breath caught in my throat. The man who killed Carter, the man who had nearly killed me, was sitting in a police interrogation room. A wave of nauseating adrenaline washed over me. Did he confess? Trayvon demanded, his investigator instincts immediately taking over. That is the problem, Ramirez replied, sounding deeply frustrated. The federal agent stepped in because the trucking company involves interstate commerce laws. They have been grilling this guy for 30 minutes. But Leo refuses to speak to the feds. He refuses to speak to local detectives. He waived his right to a lawyer, and he is sitting in the interrogation room staring at the wall. Then why are you calling us? Trayvon asked, his voice hardening. Because the suspect made one single demand. Ramirez stated, the weight of his words dropping like a physical anvil in the room. He says he will only tell the truth to one specific person. He refuses to open his mouth unless he is speaking directly to the bride. He wants Sydney. The blood completely drained from my face. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The man who drove a massive freight truck into my wedding car, killing my husband, did not want a lawyer. He wanted to look his surviving victim in the eyes. I gripped the edge of Trayvon's desk, my knuckles turning white. I did not hesitate. "Tell the federal agents not to touch him," I said, leaning closely into the phone microphone, my voice cold and absolute. "I am coming to the precinct right now." The Chicago Police Department precinct was a chaotic maze of ringing phones and shouting officers. Trayvon drove us through the dead of night, ignoring speed limits entirely. The neon streetlights of the city blurred through the rain-slicked windows of his vehicle. Every bump in the asphalt sent a fresh wave of agony through my fractured ribs, but I gripped the door handle, refusing to show any weakness. When we finally walked through the heavy double doors of the Major Crimes Unit, Detective Ramirez was already waiting for us. He looked thoroughly exhausted, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee in his hand. He warned me again that the suspect was highly uncooperative with federal agents and state troopers. I did not care about the federal agents or their stalled progress. I only cared about extracting the truth. Trayvon flashed his former federal credentials, pulling a few strings to ensure he was allowed to stand in the observation room right behind the two-way mirror. Ramirez escorted me down a bleak concrete hallway. The air smelled bitterly of stale sweat and cheap lemon floor cleaner. Ramirez stopped and opened the heavy steel door to Interrogation Room 4. I stepped inside. The room was freezing cold. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed loudly overhead, casting harsh, unyielding shadows across the scarred metal table. Sitting on the opposite side was the man who had completely destroyed my life. Leo was 45 years old, wearing a cheap plaid shirt deeply stained with dirt and engine oil. His thick wrists were cuffed to the metal loop bolted to the center of the table. He did not look like a highly trained professional hitman or a cold-blooded monster. He looked like a desperate, exhausted man who had made a catastrophic, irreversible mistake. He looked up when I entered the room, and the expression in his eyes caught me completely off guard. There was absolutely no defiance. There was no anger. There was only profound, overwhelming pity. I slowly lowered myself into the stiff aluminum chair across from him. I placed my casted arm carefully on the table. My breathing was shallow due to the sharp pain in my chest, but I kept my gaze locked fiercely onto his face. "I am Sydney," I stated, my voice perfectly steady despite the chaos erupting inside my mind. "You asked for me. The police say you refused to talk to anyone else. Now tell me exactly why you destroyed my car and killed my husband." Leo swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly. He looked at my heavy medical bandages and then back up at my eyes. "I am not a murderer, lady," he whispered, his voice raspy and shaking with raw emotion. "I am just a guy drowning in massive medical debt for my sick kid. I was about to lose my house to the bank. I needed cash fast and no questions asked." I leaned forward, ignoring the screaming protest of my fractured ribs. "I do not care about your financial debt, Leo. I want to know why you ran a red light at high speed and killed my husband on our wedding night." Leo shook his head slowly. The deep pity in his eyes intensified, making my stomach churn with sudden violent nausea. He leaned closer to the table, the heavy metal handcuffs rattling against the steel loop. "I did not run a red light by accident," he confessed, his voice dropping to a harsh, low whisper. "I was hired to be at that exact intersection at that exact time. Your husband paid me $50,000 in cash." The words hit me harder than the massive freight truck had. My analytical brain completely short-circuited. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a sick, twisted joke. "Carter paid you to hit us?" I asked, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. Leo nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with his chained hands. "He gave me half the cash up front in a duffel bag 2 days ago. He told me he would be driving a black luxury sedan. He gave me the exact route you two would take from the wedding reception and the exact timing down to the minute. But Carter was not the target, lady. You were." My lungs instantly stopped working. The sterile air of the interrogation room suddenly felt incredibly thick and impossible to breathe. He told me to T-bone the passenger side. Leo continued his words, slicing through my fragile reality like a surgical scalpel. He told me to hit the passenger side hard enough to make sure whoever was sitting there did not survive the catastrophic impact. He promised me he would hit the brakes right at the intersection and angle the car so I would only smash your side. He said he would brace himself for the crash. Then why is he dead? I demanded, my voice rising with a sudden burst of panicked adrenaline. If he planned all of this perfectly, why am I the one sitting here breathing while he is in a morgue? Leo closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking through the thick grime on his cheek. It was raining heavily, he said miserably, his voice breaking. The asphalt was slick with oil and water. When I floored the gas pedal to hit your side of the car, my back tires completely lost traction. The heavy rig hydroplaned across the intersection. I tried to correct the steering wheel, but the truck skidded entirely out of control. I missed the passenger door completely, and the heavy steel grille of my truck plowed directly into the driver's seat instead. I killed the man who hired me to kill you. The deafening silence of the interrogation room pressed down on my shoulders like physical weights. In my profession as a cyber auditor, numbers and data always told a clear story. Anomalies were never just accidents. Suddenly, every single strange occurrence from the past 48 hours violently clicked into place. The missing prenuptial agreement, the forged signature stripping me of my company, Vivian demanding an immediate expedited cremation to prevent a detailed autopsy. Carter did not die in a tragic, unpredictable accident. My charming, handsome husband, the man who had vowed to love and protect me just hours earlier, had meticulously orchestrated my brutal murder on our wedding night. He had strapped me into the passenger seat, smiled at me, and driven me straight into a paid execution. The profound grief I had been carrying for the past 2 days instantly evaporated. The tears I thought I would shed for my dead husband completely dried up. In their place, a dark, freezing cold rage began to spread through my veins. Carter Reynolds had tried to execute me to steal my life work, but he had failed. Now his family was trying to finish the job legally. They had no idea they had just unleashed a monster. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room slammed shut behind me with a sickening metallic thud. The harsh sound echoed through the sterile concrete hallway of the precinct. My legs suddenly lost all their strength. The adrenaline that had kept me upright during Leo confession evaporated completely, leaving behind a void of absolute terror and disbelief. I slumped against the cold wall, sliding down until I hit the linoleum floor. I buried my face in my good hand. Carter had not died trying to protect me. He had died because his hired executioner made a driving error in the rain. Every gentle kiss, every whispered promise, every shared laugh over the past 2 years had been a calculated performance, leading up to my premeditated murder. Trayvon stepped out of the observation room and knelt beside me. He did not offer any empty comfort. He did not tell me everything was going to be all right, because we both knew my reality had just been permanently shattered. He placed a steady, heavy hand on my shaking shoulder. His dark eyes were burning with the intense, focused energy of a federal investigator who had just found the missing piece of a deadly puzzle. A hired hitman testimony is largely circumstantial in a federal court. Trayvon stated, his voice rumbling with low, quiet authority. A high-priced defense lawyer will claim Leo is a desperate criminal lying to get a plea deal. Vivian and Trent will bury this confession under a mountain of corporate lawyers and public relations spin. If we want to destroy them, we need undeniable physical proof. We need the data. I forced my head up, forcing my lungs to draw in a painful breath. My mind instantly shifted from the mind of a devastated widow to the mind of a forensic cyber auditor. Data was my territory. Data was the only language I truly trusted, because numbers never lied. The event data recorder. I said, my voice raspy but gaining traction. the black box inside Carter Luxury Sedan. It records the exact telemetry of the vehicle in the final 5 seconds before airbag deployment. It logs speed, steering angles, brake pressure, and occupant sensor statuses. Trayvon nodded sharply, helping me to my feet. Exactly. But we have a massive problem. I checked the police impound logs while you were inside. The sedan is not there. Vivian corporate lawyers exploited a legal loophole claiming the vehicle was registered as a commercial asset under the Reynolds Real Estate Group. They secured an emergency release order 3 hours ago. The wrecked car is currently sitting in a private salvage yard owned by their family. They are moving to crush it and destroy the module by sunrise. Panic flared in my chest, but Trayvon's expression remained entirely composed. We moved quickly, navigating the dark, slick streets back to his suburban house. The moment we stepped inside, Trayvon went straight to his converted home office and locked the door. The harsh blue glow of his multiple monitors illuminated the dark room. He dropped into his leather chair and launched a series of encrypted terminals. They might have physical possession of the car, but they forgot who they are dealing with. Trayvon muttered, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with blinding speed. Modern luxury sedans are constantly connected to the manufacturer's cellular network. As long as the backup battery on the telematics control unit is still active, I can spoof the emergency diagnostic portal and pull the crash data remotely. I stood behind him, ignoring the throbbing agony in my fractured ribs. My eyes tracked the rapidly scrolling lines of code on his primary screen. Trayvon was routing his connection through a dozen international proxy servers, masking his digital footprint to bypass the manufacturer's security firewalls. For 10 agonizing minutes, the room was dead silent. The tension was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Then a green progress bar appeared on the screen. He had successfully breached the vehicle onboard computer. Downloading the event data recorder logs, now Trayvon announced, his jaw tight. "It is raw hexadecimal data. I need you to translate it." The file finished downloading, and Trayvon opened the raw telemetry spreadsheet. I leaned over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the endless columns of numbers and time-stamped sensor readings. This was my battlefield. I parsed through the complex data, isolating the final 5 seconds leading up to the catastrophic impact. "Look at the throttle and steering columns," I instructed, pointing at the screen with a trembling finger. Carter was driving at 65 miles per hour in a 40-mile-per-hour zone. The brake pressure sensor remained at 0% until the absolute last fraction of a second. He never even tried to stop. And look at the steering angle right here. 2 seconds before the crash, he jerked the steering wheel hard to the left, deliberately exposing the passenger side of the vehicle to the oncoming truck. Trayvon analyzed the numbers, his expression darkening with pure disgust. "He positioned you to take the direct hit. Leo's story matches the data perfectly." But there was another column of data that caught my eye. A column monitoring the interior cabin sensors. I traced the specific data string corresponding to the passenger seat. The weight sensor confirmed I was sitting there. But the adjacent column, the seatbelt latch sensor, made my blood run entirely cold. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I stared at the digital timestamp recorded exactly 3 seconds prior to airbag deployment. Trayvon, I whispered, a wave of physical nausea hitting me so hard I had to grip the back of his chair for support. "Look at the seatbelt telemetry." Trayvon traced my finger to the specific line of code. His large hands slowly balled into tight fists on the desk. The data log was irrefutable. Throughout the entire drive, the passenger seatbelt sensor registered as engaged. But exactly 3 seconds before the truck smashed into our car, the status changed from engaged to disengaged. Carter had not just positioned the car to ensure I would take the deadliest impact. In the final terrifying seconds of his life, while I was blindly trusting the man I had just married, Carter had leaned over and intentionally pressed the release button on my seatbelt. He unbuckled me. He wanted to guarantee that I would be ejected through the windshield or violently crushed by the kinetic force of the collision. The sheer calculated malice of that single action was incomprehensible. He had looked at me, perhaps even smiled at me under the guise of romance, just moments before unbuckling my lifeline. That was why my injuries were so catastrophic, despite the advanced airbag system. He had engineered my execution down to the smallest mechanical detail. I stood up straight, the agonizing physical pain in my chest completely overshadowed by a newly ignited inferno of rage. Carter was dead, but his mother and brother were still trying to finish his dirty work by stealing my cyber auditing firm. They had thrown me out of my home. They had tried to erase me. Download that entire file onto an encrypted offline drive, I told Trayvon, my voice devoid of any remaining grief. They think I am a broken widow. They think they can forge documents and bury the truth in a salvage yard. They are about to find out what happens when you try to execute a forensic auditor. We are going to burn their entire empire to the ground. The physical evidence from the black box proved the mechanics of my attempted murder. But in forensic accounting, mechanics are only half the story. To understand the true depth of a crime, you must always follow the money. Carter did not orchestrate a fatal collision just to get out of a marriage. Men like him were driven entirely by greed. I needed the motive, and I knew exactly how to find it. I pulled my secure work laptop from my bag and set it on the desk next to Trayvon. My fractured ribs throbbed with a dull, agonizing rhythm, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins completely masked the pain. I booted up my custom auditing software. As the founder of a cyber auditing firm, I had spent years building proprietary algorithms designed to detect hidden assets, offshore shell corporations, and laundered funds. Carter always thought my job was boring. He fundamentally misunderstood what I did for a living. I did not just balance spreadsheets. I hunted financial predators. Trayvon handed me a decrypted drive containing the metadata from the devices we had secured. I need to get inside his personal financial ecosystem. I told Trayvon, my voice cold and entirely detached. Carter was meticulous about keeping our accounts separate. He claimed it was for tax optimization, but it was a deliberate strategy to keep me blind. We need to breach his primary banking portal. Trayvon cracked his knuckles and began routing a brute force decryption protocol through his federal proxy servers. While he dismantled the security walls of Carter Banking Institution, I started mapping out the known assets of the Reynolds Real Estate Group. The numbers immediately looked wrong. The public filings projected massive profits, but the underlying liquidity was completely non-existent. They were bleeding cash. "We are in," Trayvon announced, hitting the enter key with a sharp clack. "You have full access to his personal ledgers." I dove into the raw data. My eyes scanned thousands of transaction lines, wire transfers, and investment portfolios. I bypassed the standard checking accounts and went straight for the hidden holding companies. 10 minutes into the audit, my algorithm flagged a massive anomaly: a recurring wire transfer to a high-tier corporate insurance brokerage based in Delaware. The payments had started exactly 2 months ago, but there was a massive lump sum premium paid precisely 14 days before our wedding. "Pull the records for this brokerage," I ordered, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Carter categorized this as a commercial property liability expense, but the routing number matches a life insurance underwriter. Trayvon bypassed the brokerage security protocols, retrieving the encrypted policy documents. When the PDF file finally decrypted and loaded onto the high-definition monitor, the sheer magnitude of their depravity stared back at me in stark black and white. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy, but it was not for Carter. It was a policy written entirely on my life. My breath caught in my throat as I read the principal payout amount: $20 million. Carter had insured my life for $20 million a mere 2 weeks before we stood at the altar and exchanged our vows. The policy included a specific accelerated payout clause for accidental death. A fatal car crash would trigger an immediate, uninvestigated release of the funds within 30 days. He had effectively placed a $20 million bounty on my head and then hired a hitman to collect it. This was the motive, Trayvon said, his voice heavy with dark realization. He was bankrupt. The Reynolds real estate empire is a hollow shell. He needed a massive injection of untraceable cash to avoid federal indictment for investor fraud. You were never his wife, Sydney. You were his financial bailout. I stared at the digital document, feeling a sickening mixture of horror and pure vindictive clarity. But something on the second page caught my attention. I scrolled down to the beneficiary designation section. Originally, Carter had listed himself as the sole beneficiary of the $20 million. But there was a digital amendment appended to the file. The amendment was dated yesterday. The timeline made no sense. Yesterday, Carter was already dead. Look at this, I said, pointing to the digital signature on the amendment. Carter did not change the beneficiary. Vivian did. Trayvon leaned closer, analyzing the legal jargon. Vivian is a senior corporate attorney. She used her overarching legal power of attorney for the Reynolds Family Trust to execute an emergency beneficiary transfer. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. When the news of the crash reached Vivian, she realized Carter was dead, and I was still alive. She knew the original plan had failed, but she also knew that if she could somehow finalize the hit, she could still claim the money. By legally transferring the beneficiary status from her deceased son to herself, she ensured that the $20 million would go directly into her accounts the moment I took my last breath. She knew about the murder plot. I stated the chilling truth echoing in the quiet room. Vivian knew Carter hired Leo to kill me. She was fully complicit. And when the hitman failed to finish the job, and Carter died instead, she immediately pivoted. That is why she rushed to the hospital to force me out of the family. That is why Trent brought the forged prenuptial agreement tonight. They need me completely isolated, stripped of my company, and entirely vulnerable. If you die now, Vivian collects $20 million, Trayvon concluded, his dark eyes hardening with lethal focus. And with that forged prenup, she gets 80% of your cyber auditing firm to cover the rest of their corporate debt. They are not just trying to ruin you, Sydney. They are actively positioning you for a second assassination attempt. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense. My mother-in-law was not a grieving parent. She was a ruthless financial predator, actively finalizing the logistics of my murder. They had the motive. They had the forged legal framework. They just needed me out of the picture. I closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. The physical pain in my fractured ribs was completely eclipsed by a cold, calculating fury. They thought they were dealing with a naive bride who would easily succumb to their legal bullying and violence. They were violently mistaken. I was a forensic auditor, and they had just handed me the digital blueprint of their entire criminal conspiracy. I was not going to hide. I was going to systematically dismantle the Reynolds family piece by piece until they had absolutely nothing left but the prison uniforms on their backs. Trayvon encrypted servers hummed with the immense weight of our discovery. We had the definitive motive. We had the digital fingerprint of Vivian Reynolds altering the $20 million life insurance policy just hours after the crash. I reached for my coffee mug, feeling a triumphant surge of adrenaline that temporarily erased the agonizing pain radiating through my fractured ribs. I told Trayvon to compile every single piece of data into a secure federal dossier. We were going to bypass the corrupt local authorities and hand-deliver the Reynolds family directly to a federal penitentiary. But before Trayvon could execute the final encrypted data transfer, the quiet tranquility of the suburban neighborhood was violently ruptured. Harsh red and blue strobe lights suddenly slashed through the gaps in the heavy blackout curtains, painting the walls of the home office in alternating colors of absolute panic. A split second later, a deafening series of physical blows struck the reinforced steel of the front door. It was not a polite knock from a neighborhood patrol officer. It was the aggressive, highly coordinated, rhythmic pounding of a tactical police battering ram. Trayvon immediately shoved his office chair back, his deeply ingrained instincts as a former federal agent kicking into high gear. He ordered me to stay in the room and moved swiftly down the hallway. He shouted through the thick wood, demanding identification and legal justification. The response was a booming voice amplified by a police megaphone commanding him to open the door immediately or face a hostile tactical breach. It was the Chicago Police Department Major Case Squad. Trayvon unlocked the deadbolts, realizing a breach would only put my life in physical danger. Heavily armed officers swarmed into the foyer, their boots thundering against the hardwood floors. They completely bypassed my brother-in-law, ignoring his loud demands for a search warrant, and marched straight down the corridor toward the glowing screens of the home office. I stood up slowly as 3 large officers crowded into the small room. The lead detective, a broad-shouldered man with a completely impassive face, pointed a thick finger directly at my chest. He did not ask for my name or inquire about my massive medical bandages. He simply unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and stepped aggressively forward. He commanded me to turn around and place my hands behind my back. When I hesitated out of pure, unadulterated shock, he grabbed my uninjured shoulder and forcefully spun me around. The cold metal rings clamped down ruthlessly over my bruised wrists, locking with a sharp click. The aggressive pulling motion sent an excruciating spike of absolute agony shooting through my fractured arm and broken ribs. I gasped, choking on the sudden, intense pain, but the officers offered zero mercy. I demanded to know what was happening. I told them, looking directly into the lead detective's eyes, that I was the surviving victim of an attempted murder. The detective looked back at me with open, unfiltered disgust. He formally read me my Miranda rights, informing me that whatever I said could and would be used against me in a court of law. Then he dropped the psychological guillotine. He stated that I was being placed under immediate arrest for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder insurance fraud and the malicious orchestration of the fatal collision that resulted in the death of Carter Reynolds. My brain completely short-circuited. The accusation was so astronomically absurd that the room seemed to spin. I stared at the detective, shaking my head frantically. I told him he had the wrong person and that Leo the driver had literally just confessed that Carter was the one who hired him. The detective let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He informed me that less than an hour ago, Vivian Reynolds and her elite corporate legal team had delivered a sworn affidavit directly to the district attorney. Vivian had provided expertly fabricated bank statements and doctored digital communications showing that I was the one who had secretly wired $50,000 to a shell account connected to Leo. Vivian had meticulously framed me. She had spun a flawless legal narrative, making it look like I discovered Carter was bankrupt, so I hired the hitman to execute my new husband on our wedding night just to claim the $20 million life insurance policy. She had taken my truth and inverted it, turning my victimization into a motive for capital murder. Trayvon pushed his way into the home office, his voice roaring with righteous fury. He cited federal penal codes and demanded to see the physical arrest warrant. He warned the officers that I was a severe trauma victim recovering from catastrophic injuries, and that arresting me without proper medical clearance was a massive civil rights violation. The detective simply shoved a folded piece of paper into Trayvon's chest. It was a warrant signed by a high-ranking state judge. Vivian had utilized every single ounce of her political capital and corrupt judicial connections to fast-track the arrest warrant in the middle of the night. She was executing a flawless preemptive strike to silence me permanently. As the officers began to physically drag me toward the front door, the detective leaned in close to deliver the final lethal blow to my independence. He informed me that pursuant to the strict federal asset forfeiture laws governing homicide and insurance fraud investigations, the state had officially frozen every single bank account associated with my name and my social security number. My personal savings were completely locked. My corporate business accounts for my cyber auditing firm were entirely seized by the government. I could not touch a single dime to hire a defense attorney post-bail or even buy a meal. Vivian had not just orchestrated my arrest. She had financially decapitated me, leaving me entirely destitute and defenseless against the upcoming legal slaughter. They marched me out of the house and into the freezing, torrential Chicago rain. The icy water soaked through my thin clothes, chilling me down to the bone. Neighbors stood on their porches, wrapping their robes tightly around themselves as they watched the brutal spectacle unfold. I was forcefully shoved into the back of a heavily armored police cruiser. The hard plastic seat dug mercilessly into my broken ribs, making it difficult to breathe. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw Trayvon standing on his porch, his face a mask of dark, calculating fury. He nodded at me once, a silent, unbreakable vow that he would not stop fighting on the outside. The cruiser doors locked from the outside, with a heavy, definitive clunk, plunging me into absolute darkness. Vivian Reynolds had successfully stripped me of my husband, my company, my money, and now my freedom. She thought locking me in a concrete cage would break my spirit and permanently end the war. She was catastrophically wrong. Sitting in the back of that police car, stripped of absolutely everything I had ever owned, I realized I no longer had to play by the polite rules of civilized society. I had absolutely nothing left to lose, and that specific realization made me the most dangerous woman in the entire city. The concrete walls of the holding cell were freezing. 24 hours had passed since the police dragged me from Trayvon House in the pouring rain. My fractured ribs burned with every shallow breath, and the harsh fluorescent lights above offered zero comfort. The local precinct treated me exactly like a convicted murderer. They confiscated my clothes, leaving me shivering in a thin orange jumpsuit that hung loosely over my medical bandages. I sat on the rigid steel bench, staring at the heavily scratched floor. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a biological response to grief or fear, and I possessed neither. My mind was operating like a supercomputer, compiling data, calculating risks, and analyzing the sheer audacity of Vivian's master plan. A heavy key turned in the lock. A uniformed officer ordered me to stand. He shackled my wrists again, completely ignoring my casted arm, and marched me down a narrow corridor. He pushed me into a small, windowless interrogation room. I expected Detective Ramirez to walk in with a stack of fabricated bank statements. Instead, the door opened to reveal a man in a pristine, tailored navy suit carrying a bespoke leather briefcase. He reeked of expensive cologne and corporate arrogance. He was definitely not a public defender. He placed his briefcase on the aluminum table and sat across from me. He introduced himself as a senior litigation partner at the most ruthless law firm in Chicago. A firm I knew was on retainer for the Reynolds Real Estate Group. He steepled his fingers, looking at me with a mixture of false sympathy and predatory calculation. He stated that the district attorney had enough fabricated digital evidence to indict me for capital murder. He claimed the jury would look at my cyber auditing background and believe I possessed the technical skills to wire untraceable money to a hitman. He promised me that I was facing life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. Then he slid a thick contract across the metal table. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He said Vivian Reynolds was a merciful woman who did not want to see her daughter-in-law rot in a federal cell. He offered me a plea bargain. He claimed he had spoken directly with the district attorney. If I signed a full confession admitting to involuntary manslaughter, claiming the hit was a crime of passion gone wrong, the charge would be drastically reduced. I would serve a maximum of 3 years in a minimum security facility. But there was a non-negotiable condition attached to this miraculous legal salvation. He tapped a specific paragraph on the contract. As restitution for the emotional and financial damages inflicted upon the Reynolds family, I had to immediately sign over complete ownership of my cyber auditing firm to Trent. I stared at the contract. The sheer brazenness of their extortion was almost impressive. They had used the police force as their own private collection agency. I looked up from the paper and locked eyes with the highly paid lawyer. A cold, humorless smile spread across my bruised face. "Do you honestly think I am an idiot?" I asked, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet room. "You do not care about justice, and Vivian certainly does not care about mercy. This entire theatrical performance is about the $20 million life insurance policy." I leaned closer to the table, letting my handcuffs rattle against the steel. If I sign a confession admitting to any form of homicide, the Slayer statute automatically disqualifies me from receiving the insurance payout. Vivian becomes the undisputed default beneficiary. She gets the $20 million in clean cash to save her bankrupt real estate empire. And by forcing me to sign over my company to Trent, you secure my highly profitable government contracts to rebuild their shattered portfolio. You lock me in a cage, strip my assets, and walk away billionaires. Tell Vivian her legal trap is fundamentally flawed. I refuse the deal, and I absolutely refuse to speak another word without my own legal counsel. The lawyer face hardened, his mask of polite professionalism dropping instantly. He warned me that my arrogance would guarantee my death in a federal penitentiary. He reached out to pack up his fraudulent documents. Before he could snap his briefcase shut, the interrogation room door flew open with violent force. The heavy steel hit the concrete wall with a deafening crash. Trayvon stood in the doorway, entirely filling the frame. He was not alone. Two high-ranking officers from the precinct stood nervously behind him. Trayvon did not look like a desperate brother-in-law. He looked like the apex predator he used to be when he dismantled international crime syndicates for the federal government. He held a signed document bearing the official seal of a federal judge. He walked straight up to the corporate lawyer and ripped the plea deal off the table. He informed the lawyer that attempting to extort a corporate asset transfer under the threat of malicious prosecution was a severe violation of federal racketeering laws. He advised the man to leave the precinct immediately before he found himself named as a co-conspirator in a federal indictment. The lawyer grabbed his briefcase, his face pale, and hurried out of the room without another word. Trayvon turned to me, pulling a small set of keys from his pocket to unlock my handcuffs. I asked him how he managed to secure my release when my assets were completely frozen by the state. Trayvon smiled a dark, dangerous smile. He explained that Vivian had successfully frozen my state and personal accounts, but she did not know about the heavily encrypted offshore contingency fund he maintained from his days working deep cover operations. He had bypassed the corrupt local jurisdiction completely. Utilizing his former federal badge and a flawless legal loophole, he secured an emergency bail hearing with a federal judge who owed him a massive career-saving favor. My wrists were finally free. The agonizing pressure on my chest remained, but my mind was sharper than ever. Trayvon handed me my personal belongings in a clear plastic bag. We walked out of the precinct side by side, stepping into the blinding morning sunlight. I took a deep breath of the cold Chicago air. Vivian had taken her best shot and failed. She had successfully backed me into a corner, but she forgot that a cornered auditor with nothing left to lose was the most lethal variable in any equation. The time for playing defense was officially over. It was time to hunt. We returned to the safe house in complete silence. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the living room. My body was heavily battered, and my wrists were bruised raw from the harsh police handcuffs, but my mind was operating with lethal clarity. I refused the ice packs and the prescription painkillers Trayvon offered me. Pain was a grounding mechanism. It kept my focus razor sharp. It reminded me exactly what the Reynolds family had violently taken from me, and exactly what I was going to take from them in return. We walked straight into his secure home office and locked the heavy oak door behind us. The time for playing defense in cold interrogation rooms was over. We were stepping into my domain now. We were going on the hunt. I sat down in the ergonomic chair and booted up my primary workstation. The cooling fans roared to life like a jet engine, breaking the heavy silence of the room. I plugged in the encrypted hard drive containing Carter's entire financial ecosystem, the exact drive we had extracted just hours before the police raided this very house. We needed to find the money. Carter paid Leo $50,000 to end my life on our wedding night. A man drowning in massive corporate debt does not just find that kind of liquid cash sitting in a standard checking account. Cash leaves a trail. Every single dollar moving through the modern financial system leaves a digital fingerprint. You just need to know exactly how to dust for it. I launched my proprietary cyber auditing software. I configured the complex algorithm to hunt for structured withdrawals, cash advances, or digital escrow transfers matching the $50,000 threshold occurring in the 14 days prior to my wedding night. I set the parameters to specifically flag any transaction layered to avoid federal reporting limits. The screen rapidly filled with scrolling lines of vibrant green code as my program chewed through Carter personal and business ledgers. For 20 agonizing minutes, the system found nothing but maxed out credit cards and severely overdrawn equity lines. Carter was spectacularly broke. He could not even afford the luxury vehicle he died in. Then the system chimed loudly. A massive red alert flashed across my primary monitor. It was not a direct bank withdrawal. It was a reverse-engineered cryptocurrency transfer. Exactly 7 days before the wedding, a digital wallet associated with a ghost email address had converted exactly $50,000 worth of untraceable crypto coins into clean, hard cash through a decentralized dark web exchange. Leo had received half of his payment in a dirty duffel bag, but the digital origin of that blood money was sitting right there on my screen. Traven leaned heavily over my shoulder, his dark eyes tracking the complex alphanumeric string of the digital wallet. He grabbed his encrypted federal tablet, his thumbs flying across the glowing screen. He completely bypassed the standard public ledgers and tapped directly into a restricted ghost network utilized by federal cybercrime units to track illicit blockchain movements. He ran the wallet address through the highly classified database, stripping away the artificial layers of anonymity. The blockchain nodes lit up on his screen, tracing the cryptocurrency back to its initial point of purchase. The money originated from a massive wire transfer. Trevon announced, his voice low and vibrating with dangerous intensity. A corporate bank account registered to a limited liability company based in Delaware. It is a shell company, Sydney. A blank corporate entity with no physical address, no actual employees, and no organic revenue stream. I cracked my knuckles completely, ignoring the sharp, stinging pain in my fractured arm. A single shell company is just a locked door, I replied. My eyes locked on the monitor. We are going to kick it down. I accessed the Delaware Corporate Registry database. By cross-referencing the employer identification number with national tax filings, I brutally bypassed their basic privacy shields. The Delaware company did not generate any legitimate revenue. Its sole operational function was to receive massive offshore capital injections and funnel them directly into domestic crypto exchanges to wash the funds clean. I traced the inbound wire transfers backward. The money had crossed international borders. The Delaware shell was funded by a secondary holding corporation located in Panama City. This was the second layer of the laundering operation. The Reynolds family was using classic real estate concealment tactics to hide their dirty money. They thought stacking international jurisdictions would make the cash invisible to local law enforcement. They were absolutely right about the local police. But they were dealing with a woman who built forensic auditing software that tracked international financial terrorists. I ran a highly aggressive recursive protocol on the Panamanian Holding Corporation. The corporate veil in Panama is notoriously thick, but they made a fatal administrative error out of pure arrogance. They used the exact same registered agent that the Reynolds Real Estate Group utilized for their international commercial acquisitions. My algorithm locked onto the shared legal representative and ripped the corporate veil wide open. The Panamanian company was nothing but a transit hub. The money was not staying there. It was merely bouncing through Central America to sanitize the banking routing numbers. Find the source, Trayvon demanded, pacing like a caged predator behind my chair. Where did the money actually come from before it hit Panama? I executed a deep packet inspection on the origin routing data, pushing my software to its absolute limit. The final digital jump took us across the Caribbean Sea. The screen blinked once and then populated with the ultimate origin point of the $50,000. It was a highly secure private wealth management bank located in the Cayman Islands. The account type was an irrevocable blind trust, specifically designed to shield ultra-high net worth individuals from domestic taxation and federal scrutiny. I initiated a brute force sequence to extract the signatory details of the Cayman Trust. I fully expected to see Carter's name. I expected to find out he had hidden a secret stash of cash while his real estate company burned to the ground. The decryption software chewed relentlessly through the final layer of offshore security firewalls. The progress bar hit 100%. The official banking documentation of the Cayman Blind Trust materialized on my high-definition monitor. I stopped breathing. The cold air in the home office suddenly felt like it had been sucked entirely out of the room. The Blind Trust was not named after Carter. It was not registered to the Reynolds Real Estate Group or any of Trent Holding Companies. The trust was officially named the VR Legacy Fund. I scrolled down with a trembling finger to the authorized signatory section. There was only one single name holding absolute legal authority over the offshore account that had funded the hitman: Vivian Reynolds. I stared at the name glowing ominously on the screen. The reality of the situation crashed over me with absolute terrifying clarity. Carter did not just hire a hitman on a desperate whim. He did not fund my execution himself. Vivian paid for it. My mother-in-law had wired $50,000 from her secret offshore hoard through 3 complex layers of international shell companies to put a bounty on my head. She intentionally funded the brutal murder of her own daughter-in-law to secure a $20 million insurance payout to save her bankrupt empire and her public reputation. She was not just an accessory after the fact who altered a document. She was the primary financial architect of my execution. I slowly looked up at Trevon. A deadly silent understanding passed between us in the glowing light of the monitors. Vivian had meticulously planned my death, but in doing so, she had left a permanent digital trail of blood. She had just handed me the exact weapon I was going to use to obliterate her entire existence. The revelation of Vivian's name on the Cayman Trust shifted my focus from the hitman directly to the overarching corporate entity. Why would a billionaire real estate matriarch resort to murdering her new daughter-in-law for a $20 million insurance payout? The math still felt incredibly incomplete. Billionaires do not orchestrate brutal executions for $20 million unless they are backed into an absolute corner. They only kill when they are terrified of losing everything. I needed to see exactly what Vivian was trying to protect. I directed my proprietary auditing software away from their personal offshore accounts and aimed it squarely at the main servers of the Reynolds Real Estate Group. Their corporate firewalls were enterprise-grade, built to withstand standard corporate espionage and aggressive hacking attempts. But my firm literally designed the countermeasures that federal agencies use to audit companies exactly like theirs. I knew every single backdoor, every unpatched vulnerability, and every blind spot in their financial architecture. Trevon rerouted my connection through his encrypted virtual private networks, ensuring the Reynolds Information Technology Department would only see routine maintenance pings if they were even paying attention. Within 15 minutes, the digital walls of their empire completely crumbled. I was inside their primary internal accounting database. I bypassed the sanitized public shareholder reports, the polished marketing brochures, and the fraudulent balance sheets they handed out to the press. I plunged directly into their unredacted tax filings and internal shadow ledgers. What I saw on the screen made the blood in my veins run ice cold. The magnificent Reynolds empire was a decaying corpse painted with gold. They had not turned a legitimate profit in over 3 years. Their flagship commercial developments in downtown Chicago were hemorrhaging capital at an unsustainable rate. The construction loans had defaulted months ago. The major banks had secretly restricted their credit lines, placing them on high-risk watch lists. Officially, the Reynolds family projected massive quarterly growth to the public, but the internal tax documents painted a picture of absolute financial devastation. They were technically bankrupt 36 months ago. Vivian and Trent had been desperately moving money between accounts to create the illusion of liquidity. I cross-referenced their operating expenses with their investor capital accounts, digging deeper into the financial rot. A massive black hole suddenly appeared in the data. I ran the numbers a second time, refusing to believe what my algorithm had just uncovered. Carter had been running a highly sophisticated embezzlement operation. He had systematically siphoned $30 million from a consortium of elite high-net-worth investors. He had taken their capital, which was legally meant for a luxury waterfront development, and funneled it directly into the failing operational accounts of the family business. He used stolen investor money just to keep the lights on and maintain their lavish societal lifestyle. Carter had essentially turned a respected century-old real estate firm into a glorified Ponzi scheme. But Ponzi schemes always collapse. I executed a search query for external legal communications and found a heavily encrypted hidden folder. Inside were highly classified legal warnings. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission had initiated a preliminary quiet inquiry into their financial discrepancies exactly 2 months ago. The federal auditors were preparing to issue subpoenas to demand full access to the Reynolds ledgers. The moment the federal government saw those books, Carter, Vivian, and Trent would be indicted for massive federal fraud. They were facing decades in federal prison and the absolute destruction of their pristine societal status. The entire timeline finally snapped into horrifying focus. The charm, the whirlwind romance, the sudden marriage proposal. It was never about love. It was a calculated corporate acquisition. I was the perfect target for a family of financial predators. I had no powerful family backing me. I owned a highly lucrative debt-free cyber auditing firm with pristine government contracts. I was a self-made woman with a clean background. The plan was brilliant in its absolute psychopathy. Carter would marry me. He would secure a $20 million life insurance policy. He would arrange a fatal car crash on the wedding night, eliminating me before I could ever review his personal finances. The Reynolds family would use the $20 million in clean insurance cash to partially reimburse the furious investors demanding their money back. Then, utilizing the forged prenuptial agreement, they would orchestrate a hostile takeover of my auditing firm. They intended to absorb my company's pristine assets and use my government contracts to legitimize their failing portfolio before the Securities and Exchange Commission officially subpoenaed their records. I was not a bride. I was a financial human sacrifice. My blood was meant to balance their accounting ledgers. They needed a corpse to save their empire. I sat back in the ergonomic chair, the harsh glow of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The physical pain in my fractured ribs was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying, chilling calm. Vivian and Trent thought they were untouchable because of their last name and their tailored suits. They thought a working-class girl would just roll over, die, and let them plunder her life work. They thought they had engineered the perfect corporate murder, but they made a fatal miscalculation. They brought a forensic auditor into their crime scene. I looked at Trayvon. He had been reading the data right alongside me, his large frame perfectly still. His fists were clenched so tight, his knuckles were completely white. As a former federal agent, he understood exactly what we were looking at. We had the absolute motive, we had the method, we had the irrefutable digital proof of their crimes. The Reynolds family had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Download the SEC correspondence and the internal tax ledgers, I instructed, my voice devoid of any emotion. Bundle it with the Cayman Trust wire transfers and the vehicle telemetry data. Trayvon nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard to secure the digital payload. We have enough to put them away for life, he stated quietly. Prison is not enough, I replied, staring at the screen. Vivian threw me out of a church. She tried to throw me in a jail cell. She wants to play God with my life to save her money. We are not just going to hand this to the police. We are going to destroy their legacy in front of the entire city. The digital extraction was nearly complete, but Trayvon was not entirely finished scanning the shattered digital life of my dead husband. While I was securing the offshore banking ledgers and the catastrophic tax filings, Trayvon had initiated a parallel brute force attack on Carter personal cloud storage. Carter was a man who operated on manipulation and blackmail, which meant he documented everything to use as leverage against his own business partners. He meticulously deleted his call logs and encrypted his local hard drives, but his absolute arrogance made him entirely overlook the automated synchronized backups uploading to a hidden commercial cloud server. Trayvon bypassed the two-factor authentication protocols utilizing a backdoor exploit he had retained from his days working federal cybercrimes. The progress bar on his secondary monitor flashed bright green, indicating a successful breach. The secure cloud directory materialized on the screen, displaying thousands of synchronized text messages, deleted emails, and a massive folder designated simply as audio caches. Trayvon isolated the files, filtering them strictly by the metadata timestamps. He narrowed the search parameters to the exact 48 hours leading up to our wedding ceremony. A single encrypted audio file appeared highlighted in stark white against the black screen. It was an automated call recording timestamped exactly 3 hours before I walked down the aisle. "Play it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a harsh, unyielding register. Trayvon clicked the file and routed the audio through the high-fidelity studio monitors sitting on his desk. At first, there was only the faint rustling of fabric and the distant ambient noise of a string quartet warming up in the background. It was the undeniable sound of the luxury hotel suite where Carter had been getting ready for our wedding. Then the sharp, authoritative voice of Vivian Reynolds sliced through the speakers, filling the quiet home office with absolute pure evil. "Are the final logistics confirmed?" Vivian demanded, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth or celebratory joy. "Everything is in place," Mother Carter replied, sounding incredibly bored, as if he were discussing a routine corporate merger instead of the brutal murder of his bride. "The driver knows the exact intersection. I will make sure she is completely relaxed and distracted. The insurance policy is active and locked." There was a brief pause on the recording. The sound of a silver lighter clicking and a sharp inhale of smoke echoed through the speakers. "Handle that bitch cleanly," Vivian instructed, her tone dropping to a chilling, terrifying whisper. "Do not let her blood splatter on your new wedding suit. The press will be taking photos of you at the hospital playing the devastated surviving husband. You need to look impeccably sharp for the cameras. Do you understand me, Carter?" "I understand perfectly," Mother Carter responded with a cold, arrogant chuckle. "By midnight tonight, we will be $20 million richer, and the cyber auditing firm will be ours." The audio file ended with a sharp digital click, plunging the home office back into a suffocating, absolute silence. I stood frozen, staring blindly at the monitor. 3 hours before I stood at the altar, promising to love and honor that man until death parted us, he was casually joking with his mother about keeping my blood off his expensive tailored suit. While I was in the bridal suite adjusting my veil and crying tears of absolute joy, my mother-in-law was giving the final executive order to violently end my life for a financial bailout. The sheer magnitude of their psychopathy defied any human comprehension. They were not just white-collar criminals moving numbers on a spreadsheet. They were cold-blooded, absolute monsters hiding behind designer clothes and generational wealth. Trayvon let out a low, furious breath. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched visibly under his dark skin. He reached across the desk and grabbed his encrypted federal burner phone. He unlocked the screen and pulled up a highly classified contact list. "I am calling the Federal Task Force Director right now," Trayvon stated, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. "We have the offshore wire transfers. We have the fraudulent insurance amendments. And we just secured a literal recorded murder conspiracy directly from Vivian's own mouth. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will have a tactical team kicking down the doors of the Reynolds estate before sunrise. They will drag Vivian out in handcuffs, and she will never see the outside of a maximum security prison for the rest of her miserable life." He moved his thumb to press the call button. "Stop!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the room like a physical blade. Trayvon froze, his thumb hovering a fraction of an inch above the screen. He looked at me, his dark eyes wide with sudden confusion. "Sydney, we have everything we need to put them away forever. If we wait, they might destroy more evidence or try to flee the country." "Put the phone down, Trayvon," I instructed, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the desk. I placed my hand firmly over his, forcing him to lower the device. The physical pain in my fractured ribs was completely eclipsed by a dark, calculating rage that burned brighter than any physical agony. I looked at the audio file still highlighted on the monitor. If we hand this to the local police or even your federal agents right now, Vivian will immediately activate her army of corporate defense lawyers. I explained, my mind operating with the ruthless precision of a senior auditor dismantling a hostile corporation. She will post a massive bail. She will hire the best public relations firm in the country to spin the narrative. She will claim the audio is manipulated by artificial intelligence or taken out of context. She will drag the legal proceedings out for years, hiding behind her mansion walls, sipping expensive wine, while her lawyers bury the prosecution in endless paperwork. Trevin stared at me, realizing exactly what I was saying. He knew how the American justice system operated for the ultra-wealthy. He knew that billionaires rarely faced the swift, brutal justice they actually deserved. Vivian Reynolds does not care about the law. I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, absolute whisper. She only cares about her pristine public image. She cares about her societal status, her wealthy investors, and her absolute power over the Chicago real estate elite. If she goes down in a quiet, closed-door courtroom, she still maintains her dignity. I absolutely refuse to let her keep her dignity. Traven slowly set the burner phone down on the desk. What exactly are you planning, Sydney? I turned away from the monitors and looked out the window into the dark, rainy night. Vivian tried to turn my wedding into my funeral. She tried to humiliate me in front of hundreds of people at the church. She wants to play the devastated, grieving mother in front of the entire city to secure sympathy and buy time for her bankrupt empire. I turned back to Trayvon, a cold, ruthless smile forming on my face. She is hosting a massive public memorial gala for Carter next week. She invited every major investor, politician, and media outlet in the state. She wants a grand stage to perform her final act of deception. We are going to give her exactly what she wants. We are going to let her step into the spotlight. And then we are going to burn her entire legacy to the ground while the whole world watches. Trevon secured a soundproof subterranean boardroom beneath a highly exclusive private financial club in downtown Chicago. It was the kind of establishment where billionaires smoked imported cigars and casually dictated the economic future of the entire city. We bypassed the lavish main entrance utilizing a heavily guarded service elevator. My fractured ribs screamed in absolute agony with every single step, but I forced myself to walk with my spine perfectly straight. I wore a tailored dark charcoal suit that completely concealed my heavy medical bandages. I was not walking into this room as a grieving, traumatized widow. I was walking in as the executioner. Waiting impatiently around the heavy mahogany table were the three most powerful private equity investors in the Midwest. Richard Harrington was a ruthless commercial property magnate who destroyed competitors for sport. David Kensington was a predatory hedge fund manager known for hostile corporate takeovers. Patricia Rossi was a highly aggressive venture capitalist who specialized in liquidating failing corporate assets. Combined, these three titans had pumped exactly $30 million into the Reynolds family luxury waterfront development project. They were expecting to meet Carter today for a quarterly financial briefing. Instead, they got me and Trayvon, who locked the reinforced steel door the moment we stepped inside the room. Harrington immediately slammed his heavy fist on the table, demanding to know why a surviving bride was crashing a highly confidential corporate briefing. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of intimidation. I simply opened my encrypted work laptop and projected my forensic audit directly onto the massive digital wall monitor. I looked Harrington dead in the eyes and told him that Carter was dead and their $30 million was entirely gone. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaotic fury. Kensington pulled out his smartphone loudly, threatening to call his aggressive legal team. Rossi stood up, her face pale with sudden fury, demanding to know what kind of sick, twisted joke I was playing. I silenced their shouting by pulling up their exact banking routing numbers on the screen. I showed Harrington the precise date his $10 million wire transfer was supposed to hit the designated construction escrow account. I then tracked that exact sum moving through a series of fraudulent Delaware shell companies and landing directly into the Reynolds family operational payroll. I showed Kensington exactly how his massive capital injection was illegally utilized to pay off Vivian personal offshore credit lines. I showed Rossi the Panamanian holding accounts that Carter used to sanitize her investments. I laid out the undeniable digital blueprint of a massive, highly coordinated corporate Ponzi scheme. The color completely drained from their faces. These were financial apex predators, and they had just realized they were the vulnerable prey. Harrington grabbed his phone again, his hands shaking with unadulterated rage. He declared he was calling the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Chicago Police Department immediately. He wanted Vivian and Trent arrested for federal fraud before noon. I slammed my good hand down on the mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, forcing all three billionaires to stop and look at me. I told them that if they called the federal authorities right now, Vivian would immediately file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Her elite army of corporate defense lawyers would tie up the remaining Reynolds assets in federal litigation for the next decade. I warned them that by the time the government finished dismantling the estate, they would be incredibly lucky to get 3 cents on the dollar. They would lose their money, and they would become the absolute laughingstock of the Chicago financial elite for getting conned by a desperate, failing real estate family. They stared at me, the harsh reality of my words sinking in. I offered them an alternative path. I told them Vivian was hosting a massive public memorial gala for Carter in exactly 3 days. She had invited the press, local politicians, and all of them. She planned to use that highly publicized gala to project financial stability and buy enough time to secure a new fraudulent line of credit. I leaned across the table, my eyes locking with each of them in turn. I told them to keep their mouths completely shut. I demanded their absolute silence for 72 hours. In exchange, I promised to deliver Vivian and Trent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a silver platter in front of the entire city. More importantly, I gave them my ironclad professional guarantee. As the founder of a top-tier cyber auditing firm, I had already successfully breached Vivian Cayman Island Blind Trust. Trevin possessed the federal clearance algorithms required to freeze those hidden offshore accounts. If they attended the memorial gala and played along, I would personally execute a digital asset seizure before Vivian even realized she was trapped. I would route their stolen capital back into their private portfolios before the federal government officially froze the Reynolds estate. Harrington looked at Kensington. Rossi looked at me, her eyes narrowing with intense, calculating respect. She asked if I was doing this just to secure my own financial restitution. I looked Rossi dead in the eyes. I told her that Carter unbuckled my seatbelt exactly 3 seconds before a massive freight truck obliterated our wedding car. I told her Vivian paid a hitman $50,000 to ensure I died so she could collect a $20 million life insurance policy. I stated clearly that I was not doing this for money. I was doing this to erase the Reynolds bloodline from the face of the earth. The three investors slowly sat back down in their expensive leather chairs. They put their smartphones away. We had a definitive deal. The Shadow Alliance was forged, and the trap was officially set. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing the underground boardroom and leaving the furious billionaires behind us. We stepped out into the freezing Chicago evening. The air was sharp and bit into my lungs, but I felt an overwhelming sense of momentum. The financial trap was perfectly set. Now we needed the absolute hammer of the American justice system to drop on the Reynolds family. But relying on the local authorities was a guaranteed death sentence. Vivian had already proven she owned the local precinct. She had a state judge in her pocket who signed a fraudulent arrest warrant in the middle of the night. If we handed our decrypted evidence to a Chicago detective, Vivian would know about it before the ink on the police report was even dry. The evidence would vanish from the evidence locker, and I would likely suffer a fatal accident in a holding cell. Trevin understood this reality better than anyone. He had spent his entire career navigating the treacherous waters of corrupt jurisdictions. As he drove us away from the financial district, his large hands gripped the steering wheel with intense, focused determination. He told me we were completely bypassing the state level. We were taking the Reynolds family directly to the federal government. Trayvon pulled his encrypted burner phone from his tailored suit jacket. He did not dial a generic agency hotline. He dialed a highly classified direct line to the special agent in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Task Force. The man on the other end, Agent Mitchell, was Trayvon's former mentor and a veteran investigator who despised white-collar criminals who used their generational wealth to buy their way out of murder. Trayvon did not explain the situation over the phone. He simply stated he had a radioactive package that required a secure offline handover. We drove to an abandoned industrial park on the outskirts of the city. A nondescript black utility vehicle was already parked in the shadows of a decaying warehouse. Agent Mitchell was sitting in the driver's seat. He was a formidable man with sharp, calculating eyes. Trayvon stepped out of our vehicle and handed a heavily encrypted solid-state drive directly through the rolled-down window. I watched from the passenger seat as Trayvon leaned in and delivered a rapid, flawless operational briefing. Trayvon did not pitch this as a simple domestic dispute or a local attempted homicide. He knew exactly how to trigger federal jurisdiction. He outlined a massive interstate wire fraud conspiracy involving $30 million of stolen investor capital. He detailed the illegal utilization of a Cayman Island blind trust to launder money and fund a contract killing. He exposed the $20 million life insurance fraud scheme that crossed state lines, thus violating strict federal commerce regulations. Finally, Trayvon revealed the audio recording of Vivian Reynolds directly ordering the execution of her daughter-in-law to secure a corporate bailout. Agent Mitchell plugged the drive into his federal terminal. I could see the glow of the screen illuminating the harsh lines of his face as he reviewed the offshore routing numbers and the manipulated vehicle telemetry data. The evidence was absolute and mathematically irrefutable. The Reynolds Real Estate Group was not just a failing company, it was a highly organized criminal syndicate operating under the guise of elite high society. This was a textbook violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Trayvon leaned against the federal vehicle negotiating the terms of our shadow alliance. He told Agent Mitchell that Vivian was hosting a massive public memorial gala in exactly 3 days. Trayvon explained that if the federal agents raided the Reynolds estate tonight, Vivian would immediately activate her army of highly paid defense attorneys. They would destroy hard drives, intimidate witnesses, and tie the federal prosecutors up in endless procedural hearings. Trayvon offered Mitchell a far more devastating alternative. He proposed a synchronized tactical strike right in the middle of the memorial gala. The federal agent understood the immense tactical advantage of this strategy. By allowing Vivian to proceed with her lavish public event, the Federal Bureau of Investigation could seamlessly monitor her entire network of corrupt political allies and dirty investors in one single room. They could execute a flawless sweep of the entire criminal organization while they were distracted by champagne and catered appetizers. Mitchell agreed to the terms. The federal government would officially open a covert racketeering investigation. They would secretly secure federal warrants for Vivian and Trent while freezing their offshore transit hubs. Mitchell looked past Trayvon and made direct eye contact with me sitting in the passenger seat. He gave a sharp, definitive nod of respect. The federal machine was officially moving silently and relentlessly in the background. Vivian Reynolds believed she was orchestrating a magnificent theatrical performance to save her bankrupt empire. She had absolutely no idea that the United States federal government was quietly sealing the exits and preparing to drop a steel cage over her entire existence. Trayvon got back into our car, his dark eyes burning with fierce anticipation. The local police were out of the equation. The feds were locked and loaded. All we had to do now was let Vivian walk blindly onto her own execution stage. I used a secure burner phone to call Vivian direct executive line at the Reynolds Real Estate Group headquarters. I did not use my normal, confident speaking voice. I deliberately made my breathing shallow and allowed my vocal cords to waver. When Vivian answered, I sounded exactly like a terrified, destitute woman who had just spent a night in a freezing holding cell. I told her I was completely broken and that I was finally ready to surrender. I begged her for a private meeting to negotiate the terms of my total capitulation. Vivian let out a soft, chilling laugh of absolute triumph. She instructed me to meet her and Trent at a highly exclusive private dining club in the financial district. I spent an hour preparing my physical appearance for the meeting. In the world of forensic auditing, deception is all about managing visual expectations. I needed Vivian to look at me and see a thoroughly defeated victim. I removed all my makeup, leaving my skin pale and drawn. I wore a loose gray sweater that emphasized my fragile frame and the heavy medical bandages wrapped around my fractured ribs. I did not take any painkillers, allowing the genuine physical agony to manifest in my slow, limping gait. Trevon drove me to the financial club but remained out of sight in the underground parking garage. I walked into the private dining room alone. Vivian and Trent were already seated at the head of a massive polished mahogany table. Vivian was sipping vintage champagne from a crystal flute, looking like a queen who had just conquered a lesser kingdom. Trent sat beside her with a thick leather portfolio resting in front of him. They looked at me with unfiltered, arrogant disgust as I slowly lowered myself into a chair at the opposite end of the long table. I kept my shoulders slumped and my eyes cast downward, staring at the expensive hardwood floor. "You look terrible, Sydney," Vivian stated, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "I warned you not to test the power of this family. Your bank accounts are entirely frozen. Your business assets are locked by the state. You are facing life in a federal penitentiary for the murder of my son. I hope your brief moment of rebellion was worth losing your entire existence." I forced a weak, trembling breath into my lungs. I told her she had won. I admitted that I could not fight their limitless corporate resources and their corrupt judicial connections. I told Vivian that the night in the holding cell had terrified me, and I just wanted to avoid spending the rest of my life in a maximum security prison. Trent smiled a predatory, greedy smile and slid the heavy leather portfolio across the smooth mahogany table. Inside the portfolio were the final surrender documents. There was a legally binding transfer deed granting Trent 80% absolute ownership of my cyber auditing firm. Beneath that was a sworn affidavit. The affidavit contained a fabricated confession stating that I had discovered Carter was having an affair, so I suffered a mental breakdown and hired Leo to stage a fatal car crash. It officially absolved the Reynolds family of any involvement and legally relinquished my rights to the $20 million life insurance payout. "Sign the papers right now," Trent commanded, tossing a heavy gold pen onto the table. "You sign these, and we will tell the district attorney to drop the capital murder charges down to a minor count of reckless endangerment. You will do a few months in a minimum security psychiatric facility, and then you can disappear into obscurity." I reached out with my uninjured hand and picked up the gold pen. My fingers shook violently. I let the pen hover over the signature line for a long, agonizing moment. Then I slowly put the pen down. I looked up and met Vivian's cold, calculating eyes. "I will sign everything," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I will give you my company. I will give you the insurance money. I will take the absolute blame for the hitman. But I will not sign these papers in a dark room where the media and your investors can still whisper conspiracy theories about your family. I have one single condition for my total surrender." Vivian narrowed her eyes, her champagne glass hovering near her lips. "You are in no position to make demands, you pathetic little girl." "It is not a demand," I pleaded, clasping my hands together on the table. "It is a guarantee of your absolute victory. You are hosting a massive public memorial gala for Carter in 3 days. Every major investor, politician, and media outlet in Chicago will be there. If I sign this confession in a private room, the rumors about your bankrupt real estate firm will never truly die. People will always wonder if you paid me off." I leaned forward, playing directly into her massive narcissistic ego. "Let me sign these documents publicly on the stage at the memorial gala. Let me stand in front of the entire city and confess my sins. I will tell all your wealthy investors that Carter was a brilliant, innocent man, and that I destroyed him out of pure jealousy. I will hand you the deed to my cyber auditing firm under the flashing cameras of the press. You will not just be a grieving mother, Vivian. You will be the savior of the Reynolds legacy. You will be completely untouchable. The silence in the private dining room was deafening. I watched the greedy gears turning in Vivian's head. Her absolute arrogance and her desperate craving for public adulation were her greatest weaknesses. The intoxicating idea of forcing her working-class daughter-in-law to publicly beg for mercy in front of the Chicago elite was too magnificent for her to refuse. It was the ultimate theatrical display of absolute power. Trent tried to intervene. He leaned toward his mother and warned her that a public confession was an unnecessary operational risk. He told her they should just force me to sign the documents immediately and bury the evidence. But Vivian raised a sharp, manicured hand, instantly silencing him. Her eyes gleamed with a dark, twisted triumph. "You will arrive at the hotel through the underground service entrance," Vivian commanded, her voice vibrating with authoritative delight. "You will stand in the shadows until I call you onto the main stage. You will read a written apology that my corporate lawyers will draft for you. And then you will sign your entire life over to me in front of everyone. If you deviate from the script by a single syllable, I will ensure you are arrested before you even step off the podium." I nodded submissively, keeping my eyes locked on the table to hide the lethal predatory calculation burning intensely in my pupils. I thanked her for her mercy. I stood up carefully, clutching my broken ribs, and walked out of the private dining room, leaving the unsigned documents sitting on the table. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind me. The moment I was completely out of their sight, I dropped the fragile, trembling widow act. My spine straightened, and a cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. Vivian had just eagerly swallowed a mouthful of crushed glass. The stage was officially set for her public execution. The night before the memorial gala felt entirely different from the night before my wedding. There was no nervous excitement and no champagne toasts with bridesmaids. There was only the cold, surgical precision of preparing for a massive corporate execution. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest bedroom, staring at my reflection in the quiet dark. The heavy medical bandages tightly wrapped around my fractured ribs were binding, compressing the physical agony into a dull, manageable ache. I reached into the garment bag and pulled out a sleek, tailored black dress. It was definitely not a dress meant for mourning a beloved husband. It was a garment constructed of heavy, structured wool with razor-sharp shoulders and a high, unforgiving neckline. It was absolute armor. I applied my makeup with meticulous, ruthless care, perfectly covering the fading yellow and purple bruises along my jawline and my temple. I pulled my hair back into a severe, tight knot at the base of my neck. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was no longer the naive bride who had blindly trusted Carter Reynolds. She was the apex predator of the cyber auditing world, actively preparing to tear a corrupt dynasty down to its foundational studs. I walked down the quiet hallway and entered the glowing command center of the Home Office. Trevin was sitting in his usual leather ergonomic chair, surrounded by empty coffee mugs and lines of rapidly executing code on his 4 monitors. He did not look exhausted or fatigued. He looked like a highly trained federal hunter who had just successfully cornered his prey. I asked him for the final status report on the hotel infrastructure and the digital infiltration. Trayvon spun his chair around, a fierce, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He confirmed that the digital breach was an absolute unprecedented success. The Reynolds family had booked the grand ballroom of the most elite luxury hotel in the downtown financial district for their theatrical memorial. They had hired a premium private production company to manage the complex audio and visual presentations, ensuring their fraudulent narrative would be broadcast in high definition to the press and their investors. Trayvon had effortlessly bypassed the outdated security firewalls of the hotel using a highly classified spoofed credential protocol he retained from his days at the Bureau. He had effectively hijacked the entire central server of the private production company. Every single wireless microphone, every surround sound speaker, and the massive light-emitting diode screen positioned directly behind the main podium were now completely under our absolute remote control. "We are holding the master override key," Trevon stated, his thick fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden desk. "When Vivian steps up to that microphone tomorrow night, her production team will think they are running the show from the sound booth. But the moment you give me the signal, I will completely lock them out of their own soundboard. They will not be able to cut the power to the stage. They will not be able to mute the audio feed. And they certainly will not be able to turn off that giant digital screen." I leaned over his desk, carefully reviewing the final payload directory on the primary monitor. The offshore banking ledgers from the Cayman Islands were preloaded and perfectly formatted for maximum visual impact, so even the press could understand the money laundering scheme. The fabricated insurance amendments and the falsified prenuptial agreement were queued up side by side, highlighting the blatant forgery. The damning telemetry data from the vehicle black box was synchronized perfectly with the most lethal piece of our entire digital arsenal. The audio file of Vivian giving the direct order to keep my blood off her son wedding suit was primed and ready to blast at maximum volume through the ballroom concert-grade speakers. I looked at the digital clock on the corner of the monitor. It was well past midnight. The financial and legal trap was flawlessly constructed. The federal agents, led by Agent Mitchell, were silently positioning themselves for the massive tactical sweep, combining their strike team with the local perimeter details. The furious billionaire investors, Harrington, Kensington, and Rossi, were likely ironing their expensive suits, preparing to act as the ultimate hostile audience in the front row. Vivian Reynolds was probably sleeping soundly in her massive mansion, dreaming of the exact moment she would publicly humiliate me and finally secure her $20 million payout. She believed she had won the war by violently forcing me into a public surrender. She truly thought she held all the power. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the microphone, the matches, and the gasoline. I closed the laptop, securing the final secure connection. The game of hiding in the shadows was officially over. Tomorrow night, the entire city of Chicago would watch the Reynolds empire burn to ashes. The Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom was a masterpiece of gilded architecture and suffocating wealth. A sea of black tuxedos and designer morning dresses filled the massive space. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the low hum of corporate gossip. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided silently across the marble floors, carrying trays of vintage champagne. Hundreds of VIP guests had gathered to pay their respects to the Reynolds family. The room was packed with the most influential politicians, real estate moguls, and media executives in Chicago. Flashbulbs from the press area continuously illuminated the room, capturing the tragic elegance of the evening. It was the perfect stage for a billionaire masterpiece of deception. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadows near the heavily draped service entrance, just as Vivian had demanded. My tailored black dress acted as absolute armor, compressing my fractured ribs and hiding the heavy medical bandages underneath. The physical pain was a distant hum, entirely overridden by the cold adrenaline coursing through my veins. A tiny wireless earpiece rested invisibly inside my right ear. Trayvon's voice crackled through the secure channel, confirming that he had completely locked down the hotel audio and visual network from his remote terminal. Agent Mitchell and his tactical federal team were fully positioned at every structural exit, waiting for my absolute signal. The trap was primed. In the front row, the three billionaire investors sat shoulder to shoulder. Richard Harrington, David Kensington, and Patricia Rossi looked like stone gargoyles. They sipped their champagne with calculated indifference, their eyes scanning the room. They knew exactly what was about to happen, and they played their part flawlessly, pretending to be loyal business associates mourning a tragic loss. Trent was working the room, shaking hands and accepting condolences with a solemn nod. He was already acting like the undisputed king of the Reynolds empire, completely oblivious to the federal crosshairs aimed directly at his forehead. A sharp chime echoed through the surround sound speakers, signaling the beginning of the formal program. The ambient chatter of the elite crowd instantly died down. The massive high-definition light-emitting diode screen positioned at the center of the stage flickered to life, displaying a towering, heroic portrait of Carter. He looked handsome, charismatic, and entirely innocent. It was the ultimate corporate lie projected in 50-foot dimensions. Vivian Reynolds stepped up to the polished acrylic podium. She wore a stunning black velvet gown that probably cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. A single spotlight illuminated her features, highlighting the perfect, tragic expression she had meticulously practiced in front of a mirror. She gripped the edges of the podium, taking a slow, trembling breath that echoed dramatically through the microphone. The entire ballroom held its breath, completely captivated by her performance. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight." Vivian began, her voice carrying the exact right mixture of profound grief and stoic resilience. "We are here to honor the brilliant and beautiful life of my youngest son. Carter was a visionary who loved this city and dedicated his life to building a legacy of excellence. He had a heart full of boundless generosity and a trusting nature that ultimately became his tragic downfall." She paused, pulling a lace handkerchief from her clutch to dab at the corner of her perfectly dry eye. The reporters in the back of the room frantically snapped photos of the devastated matriarch. "We always try to see the good in people." Vivian continued, her tone shifting from sorrow to a sharp, calculated edge of righteous indignation. "We welcome outsiders into our homes and our hearts, hoping to share our blessings. But sometimes that trust is met with unfathomable darkness. Sometimes the people we invite into our family bring nothing but destruction and deceit. The accident that took my son was not an act of God. It was the result of a malicious, calculated betrayal." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The wealthy elites leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Vivian was officially spinning the narrative, painting me as the ultimate villain before the entire city. "Tonight is not just about mourning a profound loss," Vivian declared, her voice rising with theatrical authority. "Tonight is about accountability. It is about cleansing the Reynolds legacy of the toxic infection that caused this tragedy. We believe in redemption, but redemption requires a full and public confession of guilt." Vivian raised her hand and pointed a manicured finger directly toward the dark service entrance where I was standing. She commanded the lighting technician to illuminate the corner. A blinding white spotlight instantly slammed into my face, stripping away my protective shadows and exposing me to the entire ballroom. "I command Sydney, the woman who orchestrated the demise of my beloved son, to step forward," Vivian announced, her voice echoing like a judge delivering a death sentence. "Step up to this stage and sign the documents of your absolute surrender. Hand over the assets you attempted to steal and publicly beg this family for mercy." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and deafening. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously in my direction. The disdain in the room was a tangible physical force. I could hear the aggressive whispering of the high society guests. They called me a murderer, a gold digger, and a psychopath. They looked at my bruised face and my rigid posture with pure, unadulterated contempt. They fully expected to see a broken, weeping widow crawling to the podium to beg for a reduced prison sentence. I did not lower my head. I did not shed a single tear. I stepped out of the shadows and began the long walk down the center aisle. My spine was perfectly straight. Every step I took on the marble floor was slow, deliberate, and echoing with absolute lethal intent. The sea of wealthy investors parted for me, their eyes tracking my every movement with disgust. I ignored them all. My gaze was locked entirely on Vivian standing at the podium. Trent stood waiting at the top of the stage stairs, holding the heavy leather portfolio containing the fraudulent confession and the corporate transfer deeds. He held out a gold pen, a cruel, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He truly thought he had won. He thought he was about to own my cyber auditing firm and secure his $20 million insurance bailout. I reached the top of the stairs and walked directly to the podium. Vivian stepped back slightly, giving me access to the microphone and the documents resting on the acrylic surface. She looked at me with eyes full of victorious venom, waiting for me to break down and sign my life away. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I looked down at the fabricated confession. Then I slowly turned my head to face the hostile crowd. The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. The execution block was fully prepared, but they had no idea who was actually laying their head on the chopping block. I held the heavy gold pen suspended over the fabricated confession. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for my complete surrender. Trent leaned closer, his eyes burning with absolute greed. Vivian stood a few feet away, projecting the perfect image of a heartbroken mother seeking righteous justice. I looked down at the forged documents that were designed to strip me of my freedom and my company. I slowly lowered the pen. I did not place it on the acrylic podium. I deliberately dropped it. The heavy gold metal hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, definitive clack that echoed loudly through the silent room. I reached out and pulled the microphone directly toward my mouth. My voice when I spoke was neither broken nor trembling. It was the cold, absolute tone of a senior auditor delivering a fatal financial verdict. "Tonight someone must definitely pay," I announced, my voice booming through the concert-grade surround sound speakers. "My mother-in-law is absolutely right about that. We are here to talk about accountability and a malicious, calculated betrayal. But the person bleeding on the execution block tonight is not me." Before Vivian could even register the absolute defiance in my words, I reached up and tapped the invisible earpiece hidden beneath my hair. It was the exact signal we had planned. Miles away in his secure home office, Trevon slammed his hand down on the enter key, executing the master override protocol. The reaction inside the grand ballroom was instantaneous. A heavy, synchronized electronic thud echoed from every single exit in the massive space. The reinforced magnetic security locks on the grand oak doors engaged simultaneously. The elite crowd shifted uncomfortably, a low murmur of confusion rippling through the sea of designer black suits and morning gowns. Security guards rushed to the exits, pushing against the brass handles, but the heavy doors were completely sealed. We had locked the most powerful people in Chicago inside a gilded cage, and there was absolutely no way out. Vivian stepped forward, her carefully constructed mask slipping to reveal a flash of genuine panic. She demanded to know what I was doing and reached out to grab the microphone from my hand. She was exactly 1 second too late. The 50-foot high-definition light-emitting diode screen positioned directly behind her suddenly glitched. The heroic, smiling portrait of Carter violently distorted into a wave of digital static. A collective gasp rose from the hundreds of guests as the massive screen abruptly shifted from a somber black background to a blinding, violent blood red. The sudden intense change in lighting bathed Vivian and Trent in a harsh crimson glow, making them look exactly like the predators they truly were. The red screen dissolved to reveal razor-sharp, high-resolution images of highly classified banking documents. The black text was massive, making it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. I looked out at the audience, my eyes locking with the 3 billionaire investors sitting in the front row. Harrington, Kensington, and Rossi did not flinch. They simply watched the destruction unfold exactly as I had promised them. I held the microphone steady and began my presentation. "You are not looking at the legacy of a brilliant real estate visionary," I declared, pacing slowly across the stage. "You are looking at the raw, unredacted internal tax ledgers of the Reynolds Real Estate Group. You are looking at an empire that has been completely bankrupt for 3 years." The crowd erupted into chaotic whispers, but my voice cut through the noise with absolute authority. The screen shifted rapidly, displaying the exact routing numbers and the fraudulent Delaware shell companies. I pointed directly at the massive projection. Carter did not build a legacy. He built a $30 million Ponzi scheme. He stole capital from the most prominent investors in this very room to fund his lavish lifestyle while the construction projects rotted into the ground. When the federal auditors prepared to subpoena his books, he realized he needed a massive injection of untraceable cash to stay out of federal prison. He needed a financial human sacrifice. The digital display shifted again. This time, the screen showed the $20 million life insurance policy written on my life, followed immediately by the digital amendment transferring the beneficiary status to Vivian. Gasps of pure horror echoed from the back rows where the press pool was frantically snapping photographs. To secure that cash, Carter married me, bought a $20 million policy on my life, and then hired a hitman for $50,000. I announced, my voice rising with unyielding power. The screen flashed the cryptocurrency wire transfer originating from the Cayman Islands Blind Trust. It clearly displayed the authorized signatory name in massive bold letters, Vivian Reynolds. Trent finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. He lunged across the podium violently, shoving me aside to grab the microphone. He screamed into the audio system, commanding the production team to cut the power and turn off the screen. His voice cracked with absolute terror. But Trayvon had completely locked out the hotel audio-visual technicians. The screen remained brightly illuminated, radiating the undeniable proof of their crimes. Vivian stumbled backward, her expensive velvet gown catching on the edge of the stage stairs. Her face was entirely drained of color. The aristocratic matriarch was hyperventilating, her eyes darting wildly across the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. The politicians and socialites she had spent decades manipulating were now staring at her with profound revulsion. She tried to shout to the crowd, claiming the documents were fabricated lies, but her voice was completely drowned out by the undeniable truth glowing bright red behind her. The flawless public execution of the Reynolds family was operating exactly according to my design. Trent's face was a mask of pure feral panic. He abandoned the microphone and began sprinting toward the heavy velvet curtains concealing the sound booth. He hammered his fists against the reinforced glass window separating the production crew from the main ballroom, screaming at the technicians to pull the main power breakers. The technicians simply held up their hands in total surrender, pointing frantically at their locked digital consoles. Trayvon had executed a total system quarantine. There was absolutely no manual override available. The red glow of the financial ledgers continued to bathe the entire room in a harsh, unforgiving light, exposing the total bankruptcy of the Reynolds empire to every single politician and bank executive present. The initial murmurs of the crowd escalated into an absolute deafening roar of outrage. Cell phone cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every second of the spectacular corporate implosion. Elite socialites who had kissed Vivian cheek just an hour ago were now shouting questions and backing away from the stage as if it carried a lethal virus. I stood my ground at the podium, my hands resting firmly on the acrylic surface. The physical pain in my chest was completely erased by the intoxicating surge of absolute justice. I leaned into the microphone one last time. "You have seen the motive," I announced, my voice slicing through the chaotic shouting of the ballroom. "Now you will witness exactly how Carter executed his final transaction." I stepped back and looked at the massive screen. The financial documents dissolved. In their place, a stark digital recreation of a vehicle interior appeared, generated directly from the event data recorder telemetry. A bright green indicator light represented the passenger seatbelt. A timer in the corner of the screen began counting down from 10 seconds. I forced the entire room to watch the final moments of my marriage. The numbers ticked down relentlessly. At exactly 3 seconds before the impact, the green indicator light snapped to a violent flashing red. The word "disengaged" appeared in massive, bold letters across the 50-foot display. The crowd gasped in collective horror, realizing exactly what that sensor data meant. But I was not finished. The visual evidence was merely the preamble to the final catastrophic blow. The screen faded to black, leaving only a single audio waveform pulsing in the center. The ballroom's surround sound system crackled. Then the sharp, unmistakable voice of Vivian Reynolds echoed through the massive space. "Handle that bitch cleanly," her recorded voice commanded, dripping with chilling aristocratic malice. "Do not let her blood splatter on your new wedding suit. The press will be taking photos of you at the hospital playing the devastated surviving husband." The recording played with crystal-clear, high-fidelity precision. It bounced off the gilded ceilings and slammed into the ears of every single guest. The silence that followed the audio playback was heavy, suffocating, and entirely lethal. It was the sound of a dynasty being instantly vaporized. The murmurs of financial ruin were completely eclipsed by the horrifying reality of premeditated capital murder. The polite veneer of high society instantly evaporated, revealing a room full of furious, betrayed people. Richard Harrington did not wait for hotel security to intervene. The ruthless commercial property magnate shoved his way past the front row of paralyzed politicians and stormed directly up the stage stairs. David Kensington followed right behind him, his face contorted with pure, unadulterated fury. The $30 million they had lost was no longer just a bad investment. They realized their capital had been actively used to fund a contract killing and construct a criminal conspiracy. Harrington crossed the stage in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Trent by the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo and violently slammed him against the acrylic podium. Trent choked, flailing his arms in a desperate attempt to break the billionaire grip, but Harrington lifted him completely off his feet, demanding his stolen capital with a deafening roar. Kensington flanked him, shouting that he would personally ensure Trent rotted in federal prison for the rest of his natural life. Patricia Rossi, the fierce venture capitalist, marched up the opposite stairs, blocking the only remaining exit path. She stood over Vivian, looking down at the trembling matriarch with absolute disgust. Vivian was hyperventilating, backing away from Rossi, until her designer heels hit the edge of the staging platform. The untouchable queen of Chicago real estate realized there was nowhere left to run. There was no army of lawyers waiting in the wings to issue cease and desist letters. There was no public relations firm that could possibly spin a recorded murder order broadcast to hundreds of witnesses. Vivian's physical body finally gave out under the crushing weight of her absolute destruction. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor of the stage, her expensive black velvet gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. The perfectly manicured facade she had spent decades building was entirely shattered. Her heavy makeup ran down her cheeks, mixing with tears of profound, humiliating defeat. She raised her shaking hands to cover her face, weeping hysterically in front of the very same elite society she had worshipped her entire life. They were not looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at her like she was a monster. Flashes from the press pool illuminated her broken form, capturing the exact moment the Reynolds matriarch fell from grace. I watched her completely unravel from a few feet away, my posture rigid and unyielding. She had tried to turn my wedding day into a slaughterhouse. She had tried to throw me in a concrete cell to steal my company. Now she was groveling on the floor, a broken, ruined woman stripped of her wealth, her freedom, and her precious societal standing. The execution was absolute, and I had not spilled a single drop of blood. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom did not just unlock, they were violently breached from the outside. A deafening crash reverberated through the massive space as a heavily armed tactical unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stormed the venue. Dozens of agents clad in dark tactical gear poured into the room, their weapons drawn, and their voices barking absolute commands that instantly froze the remaining chaos. The furious billionaires stepped back, releasing their physical grip on Trent. Agent Mitchell strode through the center aisle, his federal badge held high and his expression carved from solid granite. He did not spare a single glance for the stunned politicians or the frantic reporters. He walked directly up the stage stairs, his heavy boots crunching over the scattered remnants of the floral arrangements. Mitchell signaled 2 agents who immediately grabbed Trent, roughly pinning his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of federal handcuffs echoed loudly through the microphone still resting on the podium. Trent whimpered, his arrogant facade completely dissolved into the pathetic reality of a ruined man. 2 other agents hoisted Vivian from the polished marble floor. She thrashed wildly, screaming that she was a prominent citizen and demanding her lawyers, but her expensive velvet gown was torn and her dignity was entirely gone. Agent Mitchell stood squarely in front of her. He read the federal arrest warrant aloud, ensuring his voice carried to the back of the room. He informed Vivian and Trent that they were being taken into federal custody for massive interstate wire fraud, aggressive money laundering, and the direct solicitation of capital murder. The exact charges guaranteed they would not see a bail hearing for weeks and would likely die inside a federal penitentiary. The agents began forcefully marching the disgraced matriarch and her son down the center aisle. As they dragged Vivian toward the exit, her path brought her exactly 2 feet away from where I stood. I reached over to a nearby catering tray and picked up a crystal glass filled to the brim with vintage red wine. Vivian locked eyes with me. The absolute hatred in her gaze was finally overshadowed by pure, paralyzing terror. She opened her mouth to spit one last desperate curse, but I did not let her speak. I tilted my wrist and violently slammed the crystal glass directly onto the marble floor right at the toes of her designer shoes. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The dark red wine splattered violently across her expensive shoes, and the hem of her velvet gown looking exactly like the blood she had tried so desperately to spill. "The Reynolds legacy officially ends here," I stated, my voice cold, ruthless, and completely final. The press pool erupted into a blinding frenzy of camera flashes, forever immortalizing the exact second Vivian Reynolds was hauled away in absolute disgrace. 6 months passed, transforming the freezing winter of my betrayal into a blindingly bright summer of absolute triumph. The Reynolds Real Estate Group was completely liquidated by the federal government. The commercial properties were seized, the offshore accounts were dismantled, and the stolen investor capital was meticulously returned to the rightful portfolios. Vivian and Trent were denied bail and were currently awaiting a federal trial that legal experts guaranteed would end in consecutive life sentences. I stood inside the expansive corner office of my newly acquired commercial headquarters. The panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the entire Chicago skyline. My cyber auditing firm was no longer just a successful mid-sized business. By providing the Federal Bureau of Investigation with the flawless digital blueprint of the Reynolds criminal syndicate, my company had secured massive exclusive contracts with top-tier federal agencies and elite financial institutions. We were officially the premier forensic auditing firm in the Midwest. The heavy glass door to my office swung open. Trayvon walked in wearing a sharp-tailored suit, holding a secure encrypted tablet. As the newly appointed director of corporate security, he had built an impenetrable digital fortress around my company. He handed me the tablet displaying a flawless quarterly revenue report. The numbers were staggering, reflecting a growth trajectory that most business owners only dreamed about. Trayvon offered a rare, genuine smile. He told me the federal prosecutors had just confirmed Vivian defense team was completely falling apart. They had absolutely zero leverage left. I handed the tablet back to him and thanked him for executing the flawless security protocols. We shared a quiet nod of profound mutual respect, recognizing the unbreakable bond forged in the fires of a hostile war. Trayvon exited the office, leaving me alone with the breathtaking view of the city. I stepped right up to the thick glass, resting my hand against the cool surface. The physical pain of my fractured ribs was a distant memory. The heavy medical bandages were gone, replaced by a sleek, powerful, tailored suit. I did not mourn Carter. I did not shed a single tear for the man who tried to turn my wedding into my execution. He was a predator who fatally underestimated his prey. I looked down at the bustling streets below, watching the tiny cars navigate the complex concrete grid. The Reynolds family thought they could break me because I did not possess their generational wealth or their corrupt political connections. They failed to realize that true power does not come from a family trust fund. True power comes from the absolute refusal to be a victim. It comes from the intellectual capacity to dismantle your enemies using their own arrogance against them. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling completely whole, completely fiercely independent, and utterly invincible. The ultimate revenge was not just watching them burn. It was building an empire on their ashes and living a life they could never ever touch. The harrowing journey of Sydney reveals a profound and uncompromising truth about survival, resilience, and self-worth. Your greatest protection in life is your own independence and intellectual fortitude. When confronted with unimaginable betrayal from those who are supposed to protect us, in this case, a husband who weaponized his marriage vows for a financial bailout, and a family that treated human life as a disposable corporate asset, it is dangerously easy to succumb to grief and victimhood. However, the ultimate lesson here is that true power does not stem from generational wealth, societal status, or the polished facades people use to hide their darkest intentions. It comes from the absolute refusal to remain a powerless victim. This story teaches us that when toxic individuals reveal their true predatory nature, you must believe them immediately and act with calculated precision. Instead of waiting for a corrupt system or a flawed moral compass to deliver justice, you must actively engineer your own closure. Sydney did not defeat the Reynolds empire by engaging in emotional screaming matches or begging for mercy from heartless people. She dismantled her abusers by weaponizing her intellect, leaning on a fiercely loyal chosen ally, and allowing cold, hard facts to speak louder than any fabricated narrative. Furthermore, the narrative underscores the critical importance of financial and professional autonomy. Because she had built her own company from the ground up and possessed highly specialized skills, she could not be easily erased. Her expertise became the very instrument of her salvation. The ashes of a burned-down life are not the end. They are the fertile ground upon which you can construct an impenetrable fortress. Betrayal, no matter how catastrophic, can always be transformed into the ultimate catalyst for reclaiming your narrative. If this story of unapologetic resilience and reclaiming your power resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe for more empowering content, and share your own experiences of overcoming toxic betrayal in the comments below.